Well, first, thanks enormously for the chance to be here. This has been awesome. I was talking to my little girl, 5 years old, and she said, well, what are you doing all day? And I said, well, I've been thinking about the Constitution. I've been talking about the Constitution. She said, well, no, what are you doing? So that's actually what Daddy does, all the time. So thanks to Garrett for an interesting paper, and I agree with lots of it. Of course, the text of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is different from Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, even without the Due Process Clause, so they obviously didn't express exactly the same thing in 1866. And Professor Erler mangles Bingham pretty badly. The tip-off always is look at your Congressional Globe pages. If it's in the thousands, it's not the 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment is between the 2400s and the 3100s. I'm inclined to agree with Wong Kim Ark. Thanks for Stephen for passing back my copy of Wong Kim Ark. I realize this is not a handout. But my job here is to disagree. So Garrett proposes narrative originalism as a cure for excessive devotion to the Civil Rights Act of 1866 as the interpretive key to Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Specifically, he describes a move during the spring of 1866 from the views of Lyman Trumbull, chief draftsman of the Civil Rights Act, to those of John Bingham, composer of the Maine Clause, and Jacob Howard, who proposed the Citizenship Declaration in the Senate. I think the disease is overstated because the goals of Section 1 plainly did bear a close relationship to those of the Civil Rights Act. Moreover, Garrett's cure seems actually likely to make the disease worse. Allowing political narrative to distract us from textually expressed meaning is exactly why one might be tempted, if you're Raoul Berger, to equate Section 1 in the Civil Rights Act. So I'll first complicate things, then discuss Fairman, Fessenden, Trumbull, and textualism. So Garrett at pages 12 to 13 of the paper lists only 3 possible positions with respect to the constitutionalization relationship of the Civil Rights Act in Section 1, calling them strong, moderate, and weak. But we need to distinguish at least 5 sub-issues for 32 positions. 1, did Section 2 of the 13th Amendment and the Article 1, Section 8, Clause 4 naturalization power give Congress the power to make the freedmen citizens and prohibit discrimination against them as new citizens? 2, does Section 1 of the 14th Amendment cover everything in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Section 1? 3, does Section 1 cover more things than the Civil Rights Act of 1866? 4, was Section 1 judicially enforceable? And 5, does Section 5 allow Congress to protect more rights than Section 1? For my part, I'd say probably, yes, 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 and probably. Even if the 13th Amendment and 184 didn't authorize the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that's the hallmark of the strong view, we still might think that Section 1 goes beyond the Act, that's the hallmark of the weak view. Or we might think the Civil Rights Act was constitutional, but Section 1 only clarified that power, rejecting all 3 views. At page 10, Garrett quotes Fairman's statement that over and over in this debate, the correspondence between Section 1 of the amendment and the Civil Rights Act is noted. And he accuses Fairman of taking this reading only because of Dunning's false narrative about Reconstruction. Well, Fairman was wrong about a lot of things, and Dunning's inaccurate, grossly inaccurate account of Reconstruction, I think certainly misled Fairman about a lot of the Bingham and Howard evidence. He says, well, Bingham was confused, Howard was confused. That sort of stuff. But Fairman was not hallucinating when he was reading these statements in the Congressional Globe. Quite a few people mention the Civil Rights Act in explaining Section 1, several in claims of near identity. Whatever radicalization happened from January to May 1866, it didn't prevent people from associating the 2 provisions in May. So there's 8 main pieces of evidence from the Republicans, from 2 senators, Howard and Poland, and 6 representatives, Broomall, Elliott, Garfield, Raymond, Stevens, and Thayer, and 4 main pieces of evidence from Democrats, Senator Doolittle and Representatives Fink, Boyer, and Rogers. Now, Howard and Stevens, of course, they introduced the amendment from the Joint Committee, and Rogers was a Joint Committee Democrat. So this is 20% of the Reconstruction Committee we're talking about. Stevens said, some answer, your civil rights bill secures the same things. That's partly true, but a law is repealable by a majority. The partly is obviously important, of course. Thayer called the 14th Amendment the principle of the Civil Rights Bill, which he wanted to be permanent. Broomall said Section 1 was already contained in an act of Congress, but it would prevent a mere majority from repealing the law. Garfield said prevention of democratic repeal of the Civil Rights Act was the purpose of Section 1, precisely for that reason. Raymond said the principle of the first section came before us in the form of a bill, i.e. the Civil Rights Act. Poland and Elliott said the 14th Amendment would settle others' doubts of Civil Rights Act constitutionality. 14th Amendment opposing Doolittle, he was a Republican, but not much of one, and Democrat Fink, Doolittle was a Fink, and then there's a guy named Fink. They said passage admitted Civil Rights Act unconstitutionality. Boyer complained that Section 1 embodies the principles of the Civil Rights Bill. He also complained that it was ambiguous, and Rogers said Section 1 was no more and no less than an attempt to embody in the Constitution that outrageous and miserable Civil Rights Bill. So that's 11 explanations of Section 1 in terms of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. I've saved Jacob Howard for last because its critical context for the William Pitt Fessenden evidence Garrett stresses at page 17. So Doolittle said Section 1 was required only if the Civil Rights Act was unconstitutional. Fessenden huffily replied that nothing at all was said in the Joint Committee about providing a constitutional foundation for the Civil Rights Act. And if you look at page 2896 of the Congressional Globe, Doolittle and Fessenden go back and forth for a while down the right column of the page, and then Howard, so this is May 30th, 1866, May 23rd, a week before, Howard had filled in for Fessenden because Fessenden was sick, okay, introducing the amendment. So Howard, he jumps in, he says, I was a member of the same committee. We desired to put this question of citizenship and the rights of citizens and freedmen under the Civil Rights Bill beyond the legislative power of such gentlemen as Doolittle. Given Fessenden's literal inability to explain the 14th Amendment to the Senate, the Fessenden evidence doesn't go far. Further, when Joint Committee member Reverdy Johnson said at the end of the debate that he didn't know what the Privileges or Immunities Clause meant, Fessenden steps in and says only, we have agreed to that, to which Johnson replies, I understand not. This is, 2 lines before they vote on the thing. In sum, Fessenden, I think, says yes to Proposition 1, to Question 1, but not anymore. As for Lyman Trumbull, he said at one point that the Civil Rights Act was a court's bill. And at page 16, Garrett takes this as significant evidence of a divergence between the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. I have 3 problems with his use of Trumbull's statement. First, Trumbull was wrong. The Civil Rights Act gave the president and other executive branch officers responsibilities too. Garrett cites them at footnotes 17 and 20, sections 4, 5, and 9 of the Civil Rights Act. Second, even if Trumbull's claim were true, it's a pretty lame defense of the Civil Rights Act. The key issue wasn't where power was granted, but how much. And the serious objection was that federal courts received a huge amount of power under the Act. Third, even if the claim were true and were a useful pro-Civil Rights Act observation, the same could be said of the self-executing part of Section 1, if any. The mere addition of Section 5 doesn't give us reason to think Section 1 is any broader. Finally, textualism, I think, is a better cure for Civil Rights Act-itis than political narrative. The Civil Rights Act in Section 1 had the same goal, giving citizenship and the privileges of citizenship to the freedmen. Identity of goals, however, is not identity of original textually expressed meaning. If we're textualist originalist, which of course we should be, then the key distinction between the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment is the textual difference. Political machinations might explain the radicalization of the Republican Party between April and June 1866, but on their own, they cannot explain the extent of the divergence between Section 1 and the Civil Rights Act. Raoul Berger's focus on tangible expected applications rather than the meaning expressed in the text actually seems very congenial to talk of narrative. Berger, he looks at all this evidence that I've shown you, and he says, well, what was really going on at a level normal people could understand and appreciate? Well, the Republicans were giving citizenship and the privileges of citizenship to the freedmen, just like they did in the Civil Rights Act. That's the basic political narrative. And these bits of evidence from Fessenden and Trumbull, I think, don't really come close to overcoming it. But the Constitution is not composed of political narrative. It's composed of text expressing meaning at a particular time. So keeping our eyes on the textual ball, I think, is the only way to avoid undue distraction, either by the Civil Rights Act or by anything else.
Spot on also in terms of time. God, do you want